Hey everyone, please support what I do to help keep Greyhawk alive by subscribing to the channel. Also, please consider becoming a channel member to get early access to videos, exclusive live chats, quarterly adventure modules, and more. Thanks, and enjoy the show.
Hey everybody, one of the things that's always fascinated me is the architecture of dungeons. Why do dungeons look the way they do? Why are they designed the way they are? And I wanted to kind of talk through this today on Greyhawk Grognard. So one of the things that modern architecture, is kind of focused on is the idea that form follows function. So you design a building based on what it's for. So if there's a bank, it needs to have a big area for tellers, and then it needs to have a separate area for offices and a vault and things like that. And medieval architecture is pretty much the same. And of course, most fantasy architecture is based on medieval architecture, so it follows. So that gets me thinking. With dungeons being designed the way they are, what were they originally for? Is this their original function, or have they been repurposed? If they were, what clues can tell you what it was like? So basically, why are dungeons designed the way they are? And I've got a few ideas. Obviously, there's not a distinctive, definitive answer here. This is just kind of spitballing and teasing out ideas. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the subject down below. And there are a couple of different types of dungeons that we deal with, and each one has its own unique characteristics and properties and so forth. The first and probably the most obvious one is the tomb, and this falls into a category I call security. And the purpose of a security dungeon is to protect something. Whether or not that is a treasure or a dead body or an important piece of information or a vital laboratory or something like that. The purpose of the dungeon is to deter intruders from discovering whatever it's protecting. A tomb is a perfect example of this. There's the body in the tomb, and there's probably treasures buried with the body, and canopic jars, and all that good stuff. That's in there to travel with the body to the afterlife or whatever. But the idea of the architecture of the place is there are restricted areas of entrance, right? There's probably only going to be one entrance, and that might even be sealed or hidden or otherwise protected. There are probably going to be some aspects of the security dungeon that are purely defensive in nature. You're going to find a lot of traps. You're going to find a lot of obstacles. You're possibly going to find things like labyrinths and mazes and things designed to confuse and deter intruders. You might find guardians of some sort in an active security dungeon. Those guardians could be humanoid guards. They could be monsters that are fed on a regular basis and maybe let out to patrol or prowl the dungeon or whatever. In a more ancient and sealed off security dungeon like a tomb, those could be undead. They could be magical guardians like golems or things like that. They could be otherworldly creatures like demons or such elementals that have been tasked with guarding whatever's in there. So, the architecture that you find in such a dungeon is going to lend itself to that purpose. Very constricted entrance, lots of traps and obstacles to stop intruders and possibly guardians. So that's the first kind that I would say is the security dungeon, and it has its there are things that will tell you, aha, this is or was a tomb. If it has all of those characteristics. Now, the next kind of dungeon is a play on that. It is the prison. This is a dungeon that is designed to keep something in that wants to get out, rather than keeping people out who want to get in. it's a prison, it's a jail. You could have this be a prison for a general population of criminals. You could have it be a special prison for a certain single prisoner who is, if they escape, they're going to, ravage the land or whatever. That kind of thing. Where it has been constructed by others to keep in that particular creature or individual that's at the middle. This is not going to be something for an inanimate object, because an inanimate object by definition doesn't want to escape, because it's inanimate. It's inanimate. It doesn't it doesn't want anything. Unless you're talking like something like an intelligence sword or something, that could be, you could play with it. There's always variations. It's D&D. But, something like that is going to have its own architecture facing both in and out, because on the one hand, there's going to be inward-facing defenses to keep the prisoner or prisoners in, because they want to escape. But on the other hand, you also have to have security facing outwards, because you don't want anybody coming out to free who's ever being imprisoned. So you're going to have these kind of defenses that look inward and outward. And thus it's going to be a variant of the security dungeon, because you're going to have those same aspects of you want to deter people coming outside and going in and getting whatever's in the middle. But in addition to that, you're going to have that kind of mirrored to prevent whatever it is that's inside from getting out. And in that sense, you're probably not going to be dealing with labyrinths or things like that, because those are going to be eventually solvable. Labyrinths are deterrents; they are not defenses. They're not unstoppable, or they do not pose an unstoppable obstacle. They'll slow you down, but they won't ever stop you eventually. So you're going to have again more traps. You're going to have things like walls that only open from, with a magical password, or you're going to have one-way doors, or you're going to have locks, or magical traps and so forth. It's like I say, it's going both ways. Now, depending on the nature of the prisoner, if it's a mortal, regular kind of prisoner, then you're going to have probably living guards, and that thus you have to have an infrastructure to support them. They're going to be barracks, there's going to be mess halls, there's going to be training yards, and there's going to be a commander, so you're going to have kind of an infrastructure that makes it look like a military fort, in addition to the regular defenses. If, on the other hand, it's some sort of magical creature that's being imprisoned, maybe an ifrit in a bottle, or a demon, or something like that, then the defenses aren't necessarily going to be living. They're going, you could have more magically oriented defenses. You could have things that are unique to that particular creature. If there's some sort of barrier that a particular magical creature can't pass. Like demons and devils and silver and iron, that kind of thing. You could find those kinds of defenses, but the prison dungeon could have a lot of means of entrance, especially if it's got the living defenders, the guards, because there's going to have to be supplies brought in, and there's going to have and people are going to be coming in and going out, and there's going to be shift changes and things like that. So it's more permeable than a regular type of security dungeon, but that's because of the practicalities of the thing. So you always keep in mind when you're designing something like this, the guards have to get in and out, and they have to eat, and so forth, and supplies have to come in and go out, and so forth. So you gotta, and all of those ways in and out can be used by PCs as weaknesses to get in and exploit. So that's one of the advantages from the game side, not so much from the architecture side of having living guards. But it's a necessary evil in some cases. Now, next up is what I call the access dungeon. This is something that was created in order to access something else. The perfect example of this is a mine. Whether it's a working mine or an abandoned mine or a semi-abandoned mine, where parts of it are working and parts of it have been abandoned long ago. Moria is a great example of this from Tolkien, where there's this. The shafts of the dungeon and the chambers of the dungeon have been created in order to access that particular resource, gold or coal or iron or whatever it is, silver or gems or whatever the thing that's being dug for is. And in that case, that architecture will flow from that. There's not going to be a lot of points of constriction because you want to have easy access to get in and out. The whole idea is that you're going in there to extract some sort of resource. If the dwarves are going in there to dig gold, they need ways to get the gold out. They're not going to make it purposefully difficult for them to come out with the loot. On the other hand, you could set up a specific situation where maybe it is under siege or something, and so there are some specific defenses, and maybe they do put in some bottlenecks at specific places in order to aid in defense, but that's not its primary goal. The primary goal is extraction, which means there has to be easy ways in and out. Now, these are the best kinds of dungeons to have as being, that was its, to have repurposed dungeons, because once the mine is tapped out and all the dwarves leave to go in search of more better veins of ore, then other creatures can come into those mines and they will repurpose them. Maybe they'll build out a few more chambers here or there, or connect things or block things off. But that essential architecture is still there. So that underlying architecture of this is a mine, and you've got shafts that go up and down, and you go shafts that go laterally, and they branch out because they're following seams of metal and so forth. So that's where you get that kind of random left-right jogs and stuff. They're not really random. Those jogs in the mine shafts come from following the seams of ore. It's not capricious. It's actually, that is its purpose, is to get the rock out of the way so you can get to the metal. And that's the that architecture, that function then gives form to that kind of dungeon, and you can create those kinds of galleries. And this is a perfect, if you like your dungeons to be very vertical, this is a perfect way to do that, because the seams of ore can go in all kinds of crazy directions. So you're going to have steps going down, you're going to have sloping passages, you're going to have elevator shafts, everything to follow where those seams of metal go. So this is a perfect excuse to do that. And another thing that sometimes will happen is, in the course of mining, you will open up into an already existing natural system of caves, which I'll get to in a second. Now, the natural cave system is a unique kind of dungeon, and it is one that you can either find on its own, or you can have it as part of a larger dungeon. And the classic scenario, as I just mentioned, is that as you're digging out one of these other kinds of dungeons, you stumble on this series of caves and caverns and drifts and galleries and tunnels and chasms and so forth, that are already there. And this, in this particular case, there doesn't have to be a lot of rhyme or reason to it, because those are going to be carved out of soft rock usually by water erosion, and the archetypical example of this is called karst topography. If you search for that online, you'll find all kinds of crazy examples of really cool things. That's where you see all the stalagmites and stalactites, and there's sinkholes, and it looks cool as hell. And you can really use that. A lot of times in the old dungeons, you'll find that those natural cave systems were at the bottom of the dungeon, because the idea is that they were building the dungeon, and we found all these caves. And then they sort of repurpose the caves for their own purposes. And you can take those caves and you can kind of work them and so forth. The Underdark, the underworld in Greyhawk is a perfect example of this, where there's just this natural series of caves that go out for miles in all kinds of directions. It doesn't have to be that extensive, but the idea is that you can mix and match different kinds of dungeon architecture by having this natural cave system be discovered during the course of construction, and then either sealed off or repurposed, or maybe that leads to even something else. or maybe it was already inhabited and they had to seal it off to defend against whatever was coming out of it, like the Balrog and Moria, that kind of thing. So you have these things, and if you look online, there are extensive maps and diagrams of some of the larger ones. Here, where I live in the Northeast, there's all kinds of these huge caverns. Some have natural rivers going through them. If you got in the Southwest, the same deal. There's these enormous cavern systems. Carlsbad Cavern is one. Crystal Caves in Pennsylvania is another one. There's just these enormous, gorgeous, I've been to a couple around here, gorgeous, really inspiring kind of things. And some of them are scary too, because you're going down, and all of a sudden it cuts you off. And you can get stuck. People have died spelunking in these things because they get stuck in these little narrow crevices and they can't get out, which is something that you don't normally think of in a D&D scenario, but if somebody is going solo, that could actually happen. So it's sort of a natural oubliette. So that's yet another kind of dungeon, is the natural cave system, and that one doesn't have to follow necessarily any architectural rules other than cool irregular architecture is what you're going to find. Irregular designs of tunnels and big caves and so forth. Now another one, and this is where I see a lot of the dungeons of like kind of mega dungeons coming from. Is what I call the defense dungeon, and the purpose of these dungeons is to defend the underground portions of a castle or other kind of structure on the surface from being attacked from underground. So historically, obviously there would be, if a castle or a city were under siege, the besieging forces would send out what are called sappers, and they dig tunnels under the walls, and the idea is they're either going to undermine the walls, later on they would put gunpowder under there and try to blow the walls up, or they'd actually try to dig tunnels and then pop up in the middle of the thing and get troops in so they could open the doors and that kind of thing. In a magical environment such as the D&D game, you're going to have much more access to that kind of underground stuff because you have orcs and goblins that can, and dwarves and gnomes that can dig at really accelerated rates compared to humans. You have magical digging, either with spells or magic items. You could summon earth elementals, or that kind of thing, or Zorns or things like that, that you can use to dig tunnels and immediately access the enemy's fortress. So in response to that, the enemy builds these enormous and deep levels of dungeons to basically stop the enemy. And this is a variation on the security dungeon, except it happens underground, because the scenario from the designer's point of view in this type of dungeon, the scenario is somebody is coming in underground to try to get into my dungeon, into my castle. How do I stop them? So you stop them by putting in mazes and labyrinths and traps. You put in opportunities for your own troops to ambush others. You put in secret doors so that your troops can move around from place to place very rapidly and the enemy can't. You put secret ways around things like pits that your troops can get around and the enemy can't. You put in pit traps and pits with spikes and covered pits and so forth, all to confuse and harm the enemy. So if the enemy has dug his tunnel and pours in all kinds of orc troops to take over your castle, they get lost in the dungeon, they're falling into pits, they're getting hit by portcullises coming down off, or falling blocks of stone coming out of the ceiling. The purpose of these dungeons is to stop invaders. And that is why you see this kind of architecture. So, for example, you're going to see in a lot of dungeons from the old days, you'll see these, straight corridors with a little cutout that, like a little 10 by 10 cutout, and then the corridor goes on. That alcove is actually there for the defenders to hide in, so that they can ambush take pot shots at invaders, and then they duck behind it for cover. So, remember in AD&D, you get like 90% cover. Your armor class shoots up to something that's really hard to hit. So if you're in one of these things, you go around the corner, you shoot your crossbow, and you go back behind, you're under an enormous amount of cover, and it's going to be very difficult for the enemy to come in and hit you, because you've got all this great cover, especially if there are more of these on different sides, and you're all peppering the intruders. So that is, you're going to see these kinds of architectural features in a defense type dungeon that will be used once the dungeon's abandoned and has been taken over for another use. Then the defenders that are there now are still going to use those features for that very same purpose, but this time it's going to be against the explorers, the PCs. So once again, we have the form following function. The function is defending, and the current inhabitants, whoever they are going to be aware of these features and are going to use them. My own Castleman Archmage, that's made explicit. The orcs will use these kinds of architectures to defend their territory. The kobolds will sneak around through these secret passages and ambush things and then run away again. Because they are there, they were built originally to defend the castle against invaders. Now they're being used by the new inhabitants to defend again against what they perceive as invaders. So that is the defense type dungeon. And then we come to the last type, and this is the Funhouse Dungeon. This is the dungeon that was made by the insane demigod or whatever, just because he could. It's often explained as, it was made by magic. But originally, that dungeon, in almost all cases, will have been another type of dungeon, usually a defense type dungeon. So if you look at the architecture of like Castle Greyhawk, of what we know about it, it starts off pretty normal. With a lot of mazy passages, and there's some defensive features and stuff like that, and then it gets weirder as it goes on. So my theory is that originally Greyhawk Castle started as a defense dungeon, and then once Zagiag achieved demigodhood, he went wild and just started expanding it out with magic and putting in all kinds of crazy stuff. And then he discovered these caverns at the bottom and went crazier there. But the idea is, if you have that as your scenario, or at least at some point in the history of the dungeon, something like that happened, then that you can use that to explain some areas of your dungeon. But it's better if it's not everything. It's better if it has the verisimilitude of having a real function in most parts of the dungeon, and then a few parts go absolutely wacky, because that's the influence of whoever the insane mage or wizard was. So so you can combine it. So and that is another feature that I mentioned it in the context of the natural caverns. That you can kind of mix and match these things. You can mix and match these things in all kinds of combinations. You could have a defensive dungeon that also happens to have a tomb in it, which is a protective dungeon. You can have little mini parts of things that are specific, and you'll see those other specific kinds of architecture in them, because again, the form follows the function. If you have function A over here and function B is connected, but it's over here, you're going to see those subtle differences. You're going to see those constricted points of access in that one little part. And if you're clever, if your PCs are clever, they'll glom onto this, and they'll realize, okay, now we're in something a little bit different because it feels different. Maybe you could actually have your gnome or dwarf characters, be able to try to sense if they see that, maybe an outgrowth of their ability to discover new stonework, that kind of thing. It might not necessarily be new, but it is different. And maybe they'll be able to tell those subtle differences. So anyway, hope you enjoyed this little rambling of mine on architecture of dungeons. What do you think? Have you ever considered these kinds of possibilities? Do you design your dungeons with any kind of rhyme or reason for what the original function was, or do you just the orcs need to have something here, so I'm going to put something here, which of course is absolutely perfectly acceptable. It's game. That's how it's supposed to be. So let me know what you think in the comments. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will talk to you later.
Thanks for watching today's video. Please remember to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Below you'll find links to my Patreon, which helps make these videos possible. You'll also find the web store where you can buy my books, and my blog where you'll find all sorts of free downloads and other articles. Thanks, and have a great day.